Good morning. We here at Wesley United Methodist Church are so pleased to have you joining us for this morning's message. Today, our text is taken from 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 through 12. Let's do a little reminiscing this morning. Those of you who are a bit older can remember once upon a time, long, long ago, when there was no such thing as the internet. To our younger folks, yes, believe it or not, way back there in the last century when I grew up and was in school, there was no such thing as the internet, personal computers, or smartphones. Yes, I know it sounds simply prehistoric, but it's true. Back then, if you needed to learn more about something, needed to gather some resources, say in order to write a paper for school, you had to do some research. And research then actually involved going to the library and reading about your topic in an actual book. And believe it or not, your scope of research was limited by the number of books and magazines that your library had on the topic you were researching. With the advent of the personal computer and access to the internet, an almost limitless amount of information, now you don't have to go anywhere. You can just sit at your desk on your computer and get all the information on any topic you choose. All you need to do is type in a topic on your web browser and Google will go get it for you. But according to some people, this still requires a bit too much work. I mean, you have to actually sit up and physically type in the information on your computer that you want to learn about. For those who have smartphones, they don't even have to get off their couch. All they must do is call up their personal assistant to answer their questions for them. Now you can just ask Siri or Alexa to answer your questions, and they will do so. And now you can even set your phone so that Siri has a British accent, which research claims most Americans believe makes her sound more intelligent and sophisticated. To answer questions like, who was the 6th President of the United States? Or is it going to rain tomorrow? Siri does very well at answering those kinds of questions. But if you want to receive answers to some of the most troubling and perplexing questions in the universe, you would likely do better consulting a different source. For that, you need more than just information, facts, and figures. You need both knowledge and wisdom. For instance, if you were to ask your smartphone a really deep philosophical question like, what is the meaning of life? It will respond just like a good politician and simply duck the question. Here are some examples that were tried on Siri, which is iPhone's personal assistant. Question: which came first, the chicken or the egg? Siri's answer: I checked their calendars. They both have the same birthday. Question: how much would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? Answer: just because it could doesn't mean that it would. Question: where's Elvis Presley? Answer: my sources tell me Area 51, but that's classified. And the ultimate question: what is the meaning of life? Answer: I find it odd that you would ask this of an inanimate object. Well, that answer is kind of cute, but it really isn't very helpful. Now, as I read through these questions, I also thought of some other questions that have always bothered me, and that I would also like to ask Siri. I'm also sure that others have also agonized over these same deeply perplexing questions as well. For instance, why do you say the alarm clock is going off when it is actually turning on? Question: why does spring water that has supposedly trickled through the mountains for centuries go out of date next year according to the date on the bottle? Here's an engineering question to test two widely accepted rules of thumb. If a cat always lands on its feet and a slice of buttered bread always lands buttered side down, what would happen if you tied a slice of bread onto the back of a cat and threw it in the air? And lastly, here's a good example of how some people can read the Bible and read things into the text that it simply does not say. Example, who is Humpty Dumpty, and what are some of the facts surrounding the accident? Where in the text of this popular nursery rhyme does it tell us that Humpty Dumpty is male, or that he is an egg? Yes, we are just full of questions. Some really important ones and others, well, not so much. But one thing that becomes clear very quickly is that Siri and Alexa do not have all the answers. And when we need to get answers to some really important questions like, why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? Or why is there suffering in the world? Who should we ask? For answers to these kinds of questions, you need to tap into a source that Siri does not have access to. You need to ask God. We say God because we are talking about Solomon today, and Solomon obviously did not have a smartphone. He did not have a Siri to help him answer the really difficult questions of life, but he did have a relationship with God. This relationship God had promised to his father David when God told David that he will be a son to me, 2 Samuel 7:14. Solomon was a young man when King David died, and at that point he began to understand the responsibilities he would be faced with as Israel's king. So God reminded Solomon of his promise to his father and told Solomon, "Ask for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." So if you had been in Solomon's shoes, what would you have asked for? I would bet most people would have asked for wealth. Many might have asked for good health and long life. Some might even have asked for an exceptional musical talent or something similar. But Solomon thinks carefully, and to his credit, he asks for something that will benefit others instead of just himself. He realized and acknowledged the fact that he was young and inexperienced, and admitted that he did not know how to go out or come in. Verse 7. How many young people today would admit to that? He understood that being an effective leader to his people would be a very difficult job. So after giving God's offer some thought, he asked for wisdom. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this, your great people? Verse 9. One thing that we should call attention to is that God also offered wisdom to the first humans. But then they tried to take a shortcut to get it. The ability to discern between good and evil was something that Adam and Eve hoped to get by eating the forbidden fruit. However, they listened to some very bad advice, and if they ate it, they would be like God. They failed to remember that true wisdom comes from God and is something that is learned through a long-term relationship with God. Adam and Eve were enticed by the serpent's offer to be like God, or become gods themselves. And humans have been making the same mistake ever since. This is why the secular world has such a difficult time discerning between what is evil and what is good. We humans can create, manage, and manipulate knowledge, but true wisdom comes from God alone. Solomon understood this truth, which no doubt he learned from his father David. And because he chose so wisely and did not choose the things that would only benefit himself, we read that God was very pleased, and that he would not only grant Solomon a discerning mind, but that he would be the wisest person that had ever lived or would ever live. And because Solomon had asked God for wisdom instead of riches or long life, we read that God decided to also give him what he did not ask for, riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all of your days. But we must remember that God offered these things to Solomon with strings attached. All these things would be added to Solomon if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked. Verses 13 and 14. For Solomon, as for us today, wisdom was not something to be easily gained, but rather something to be learned over time through a long-term relationship with God. And something else that Solomon understood is that when knowledge is tempered with wisdom, it is a blessing that can draw us closer to God. But as science begins to unlock many of the secrets of the natural world that God has created, our level of wisdom will be tested. When knowledge is not tempered with wisdom, and when we fail to have a long-term relationship with God, that is when our vast accumulation of knowledge can become a curse. With our knowledge of the natural world increasing exponentially, and our ability to change it on molecular or a genetic level, we now also have the ability to damage our world beyond our ability to fix it. I'm sure that most of you can remember the movie Jurassic Park. Well, the first time I saw it, I was in awe because it was such a great story and even a very believable one. That movie, though, is almost 25 years old now. But there was one line in it that I will always remember. As we continue to make progress and we keep increasing in our level of technology, we need more and more people around us who will not ask the question, can we, but should we? When I read about surrogate mothers battling with biological mothers over whose child is it really, and husbands and wives fighting over frozen embryos in divorce settlements, it makes me wonder. When genetic engineers have the capability to clone human beings for spare parts for the wealthy, and to create designer babies with all of the attributes their parents desire, it begins to get a little scary. And when we begin to engineer GMOs by taking genes from a fish and splicing it into genes from a plant, or begin crossing human genes with animal genes, that is when someone should be questioning what we are doing and asking not, can we, but should we? Like Adam and Eve, when we begin to think of ourselves as like God, that is when it's time to take a step back and rethink what we are doing. Unlike Siri or Alexa, to be truly wise is to admit that we do not have all the answers. I think it was Socrates who once said, "I know that I am intelligent because I know that I know nothing." While Solomon was likely the wisest person who ever lived, his story is also a cautionary tale for us, because in his latter years, we know that Solomon turned his attention away from God and toward his own self-gratification. He began to focus more on gaining wealth, building up his military, and forging alliances by marrying foreign wives than on being a wise and just king. These were also the very things that God had warned the kings of Israel not to do back in the days of Moses. Deuteronomy 17, 16, and 17. Yes, we all could use a little more wisdom. But are we doing the things in our lives that will help us grow in our wisdom? James reminds us that we should submit yourselves therefore to God. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. James 4, 7 through 10. When we do as Solomon did in his early years, humble ourselves and ask God for wisdom and cultivate a lifelong relationship with God, we will learn to ask the right questions, and then we will be ready to accept the answers that God gives us. And in that process, we will also gain in our wisdom, so that we may be salt and light. Amen.